Hello, and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today, we need to talk about fascism. In this, I want to talk about fascism in a way that makes sense of fascism as it currently operates in the world. We are seeing a, a kind of pluralistic fascism that is growing in a kind of networked manner rather than the tradition of a fascism arising through a singular leader figure promoting it under the name of fascism. Um, so it's important to understand what the underlying traits of fascism are and what it actually means for our society. And I think one of the things to remember first is that fascism isn't just the thugs or the black shirts in the streets. It's not just the people who immediately appear to be extremists. As fascist ideologies spread, then the ordinary people become fascist, and uh, it makes it invisible to people who often deny the fascism of the underlying ideas, even though they are actually quite fascist, simply because they're not dramatic and they're not opposing the current regime. So I would say that the biggest form of fascism in the world today goes under the name of neoliberalism. Um, so I'll explain why it's fascist later. I'm not saying that neoliberalism necessarily has to be fascist per se as an ideology, but rather that uh, the project as a whole has become dominated by forces of fascism. So neoliberalism has been the main uh, ideology, the orthodox ideology in all Western political powers since the Thatcher Reagan era. And it is not something confined to one side of the political spectrum. Being conservative doesn't mean you're not neoliberal. In fact, quite the opposite. Conservatism is very much associated with the fiscal conservatism, which is a key part of neoliberalism. So we first have to, we need to get rid of the idea that these things are a binary. We shouldn't fall into a false dichotomy of liberal versus conservative. That is not the way these things actually work. So the neoliberalism might not be necessarily fascist, but it does have an intrinsic tendency towards fascism, and we've seen the affinity between neoliberalism and fascism going back to the Pinochet's Chile or Suharto's Indonesia or Argentina under the junta. We see that neoliberal ideas lend themselves to fascist uh, governing styles of politics. So, to sort of illustrate how banal fascism can be, I think I'd like to refer back to a poem written by Michael Rosen back in 2014, and this is how it goes. Its title is Fascism I Sometimes Fear. I sometimes fear that people think that fascism arrives in fancy dress, worn by grotesques and monsters, as played out in endless reruns of the Nazis. Fascism arrives as your friend. It will restore honor, make you feel proud, protect your house, give you a job, clean up the neighborhood, remind you of how great you once were. Clear out the venal and the corrupt. Remove anything you feel is unlike you. It doesn't walk in saying, our programs mean militias, mass imprisonments, transportations, war, and persecution. So that's the end of the poem. And I actually think that he wrote that in 2014, and we're really at the point where it is walking in saying our program means militias, mass imprisonments, transportations, war, and persecution. So we actually, it shows the level to which we have allowed a creeping fascism to take over already in the last 10 years, I would argue, obviously more like 30 years, but particularly in the last 10, 15 years, it's been there to be seen for people who have eyes to see it. And just as a reminder, again, another reminder of the banality of it all, I want to refer to Gunter Grass, who, in his 2006 memoir, Peeling an Onion, he outed himself as a Nazi. Now, he is the author of The Tin Drum, and he was prominent in condemning um, West Germany's failure to uh, deal with its Nazi past, with its tendency to allow Nazi criminals to maintain positions of authority. And he condemned Reagan's visit to an SS grave in the 1980s. I can't remember the exact date. When it had been assumed, and he allowed it to be assumed, that he had served in the kind of home guard type units in World War II as a teenager. But in fact, he was in the Waffen SS. So he was conscripted. The reason he was conscripted was because he applied to go into a U-boat, into the submarine service, and then they conscripted him and put him in the Waffen SS, which, I mean, he was conscripted, so it's kind of a little bit, seems a little bit silly to say that, he has to be dethroned from his position of recognition because he was in the SS when he was conscripted. But he kind of also, like, in the book, he points out he was a genuine Nazi. So he was in the Hitler Youth, like virtually everyone, but he believed in Adolf Hitler. He believed in all of it. I mean, he wasn't unusual. It was normal, But he was an actual Nazi, and that's, I think, the point that he's trying to make. The upshot of some of this was that because he wrote about Danzig, he is he was is a revered figure in Danzig, and the mayor of Danzig, um, after these revelations, condemned him and wanted to strip him of his recognition as a cultural ambassador or whatever it was. But the people opposed it because they did recognise that this is a there's Nazis and there's Nazis, really. The sort of people he was condemning, like he mentions in his memoir the judge who sentenced his uncle to death, who um, who just carried on as normal after the war, still retained his position, even though he had done some of the worst dirty work for the Nazis. Now, Gunter Grass was shocked when he found out about what had been going on in Nazi concentration camps. And as he points out, even though he had opportunities, he never denounced anyone when he was in the Hitler Youth. He was a believer, but he wasn't ironically, he wasn't a Grass sort of person. But he wasn't a very authoritarian person, and I think that's quite a key thing. In fact, Holocaust studies have shown that authoritarianism is an absolutely key factor in participation. But the fact is that had he been sent to be a guard in a concentration camp, he probably would have done terrible things. So you don't, once fascism it becomes the normal reality, you don't need to be a special person to be a fascist. You need to be a special person to be an anti-fascist. And so I think that is what we need to cultivate is um, the the ability and the willingness to be opponents of this from the outset. And you don't do that by saying, "Oh no, you can't use the word fascism. Oh no, that's wrong." You know, if you can point to something and say, you know, that it's bad, then you shouldn't try and police the way people describe it like that. And I think we've gotten to the situation we're in a lot. You know, the saying that some people use is the road to fascist domination is lined by people along saying, telling you to stop overreacting. You know, so anyway, so we really need to start with what fascism actually is, so that we can understand what it is that we're dealing with here and why it is an appropriate term to use. Now, words are just words, and some are more solid in their meaning than others. I mean, it's not that I think language is completely arbitrary. Language only works because it connects meanings that exist in a network. If it was, you know, like if it was um, possible for people to have completely different meanings for anything in their own heads, then we wouldn't really be able to communicate. So there is a limit on how how much flexibility or slippage there is in words. They are confined to some extent, but some are more, as I say, more solid than others. Fascism is not a word that can be pinned down completely. I mean, that's you know, you can't have a definite definition of fascism. But from its origin, um, Mussolini defined it originally. So the original definition would be people who followed Mussolini's political thought. And so uh, one of the things he said, he wrote um, various things about political thought that might not be as influential on fascism as all that. But one of the things he said was that it was corporatism. He said that the word fascism could be replaced with the word corporatism. Now, fascism refers to the Roman fasces, which means bundled together. And it's the idea that a single stick can break, but you can bundle together thin sticks and they have the strength, a great deal of strength. Right. So when he said corporatism, he did not mean something in the capitalist style of what a corporation is. What he meant was that people's interests um, uh, should be represented not through class struggle, but through different corporate um, entities which have their own hierarchy competing against each other. So people who work in, say, the printing industry would all consider themselves to be together in the same boat under the boss. The boss would represent them, and they would go to the boss. So it's a highly paternalistic system. Uh, and of course, it didn't necessarily have that much to do with the way he governed as a fascist either. So these these political ideas, these political theories, are not necessarily uh, incredibly important in fascism. Um, More, there were more sort of maybe tendencies that had more effect, and it was picking up on things that were lying around at the time, of course. So before World War One, there was a lot of romanticism and in the air, and people feeling that they had lost authenticity in their lives, and often they were feeling that warfare was a way of regaining that authenticity. Although there were other strains, we had modernism was really challenging a lot of um, ways of doing things at the time, so um, it, the World War One cured most people of that romanticism. Quite frankly, it was a nightmare. It made people reassess what they thought of modernity and progress and all of that sort of thing. But the fascists kept a romanticism, and I would say that it was a kind of bloody and twisted romanticism. So, I mean, you know, it, romanticizing grit and nastiness as much as anything else. Um, yeah, so um, obviously, the sort of thinking that contains very dangerous seeds of violence in it. Um, but when like the um, this sort of romanticism, of course, I think animates the street thugs and so forth. But um, I think there's also an authoritarian strain in in fascism uh, that kind of once it's in power, it becomes a sort of orthodoxy that fits people's ideas of keeping other people in their place. So it kind of becomes a kind of ultra conservatism as well, and it generates then its main support. It's always its main support. It comes from a broader sector of the public, often the petite bourgeoisie, who like the petite bourgeoisie. That's the people like the shop owners and the um, in the traditional sort of division of classes. Like they're not major owners of capital, but they are they have some capital, and they're not um, selling their labour. So the petite bourgeoisie, but also I think the lower middle class in general. The people who feel that they have some status in life and don't like the idea of left wing challenges to the hierarchy because they happen to be one or two rungs up the hierarchy. Now, for, fascist thought um, is in a lot of ways a very practical reaction to the upwelling of leftist thought. Now, it can be, I mean, I think, or challenges to the social order from below. I think it doesn't have to be leftist thought. So I would argue that the KKK was basically fascism before the idea of fascism arrived. That if you like a lot of definitions of fascism are basically just lists of boxes to tick. Which like if you tick a certain, or it's not that they say this, but it's almost the implication is you tick a certain number of boxes, like 80% of them, then you are genuinely fascist. Well, the KKK really ticks pretty much all the boxes in its ideology. It's just that they didn't call themselves fascists and they were around before there was fascism, and they really kind of arose uh, in response to the threat to the social order posed by Reconstruction and the potential of setting up a more justly ordered society in which black people had some economic power and political power, as well um, as being free from slavery. So, as there is a tendency for not for later fascism to pick up and use left wing symbology and left wing thoughts and left wing rhetoric and kind of twist it into a right wing project. And I think that's something that is um, really important to them. And, yeah, um, I consider the Nazis to be fascists. Some people don't for definitional reasons, but their choice of red and black, for example, and the kind of way they appropriated the imagery that had been developed by revolutionaries to kind of create a visual um, sign of their political affiliations. Um, so it is also, I mean, I think it's fair to say that fascism is kind of like an inverse of anarchism as well. I mean, so uh, neither of them are fully developed political ideologies as such. They're actually kind of something a little bit beyond um, ideology. They become more of a way of doing, or they sit alongside political ideology. So both anarchists and fascists write political theory, for example, but it's not that the theory is the essence of either movement. So the fascists don't need to believe in corporatism to be fascist, and I don't think anyone seriously thinks that they do. And nor does that political ideology shape the way they govern that much. So that's why, I mean, even more than other political movements, which are hyphenated often because of different people's different approaches and people's way of defining them as well. Often, like it's about the way people afterwards see them, or contemporaries see them that gives them these names. But there's anarchism and fascism often hyphenated with other things. Um, but I do think they're kind of opposite as well, because um, and we could consider like fascism to be a radically instrumentalist, right? So, um, uh, or like in Max Weber talked about instrumental rationalists versus value rationalists, and so you could think of fascists as these radical instrumental rationalists, and anarchists as the as radical value rationalists, and fascists, as a result, do whatever works for them, and anarchists, as a result, often are prevented from doing things, often very much to the frustration of people. Well, of their other leftists, that they are sometimes rigid in their principles and called ultras and so forth because of this adherence to values. And I think these are like this. Fascism is more about like anarchism. These are more about a broader um, approach rather than being tied to particular theories of the way politics works and an ideology built on that. So I think they are kind of meta ideologies in some senses. So yeah, and the relationship of fascism to leftism as well is crucial in another way, in that they often project themselves onto. They create um, this sense of parity and opposition with when the fascists are out of power, with dissidents from the left. So they position the government in the centre and say it's failing, and then say there's these guys over here, the far left, and we are the far right. And so obviously this was something that Goebbels did very intentionally, especially when they went into Berlin. It targeted Berlin, which was a very left-wing place, in 1930 they went in, or maybe 29. So they sent in their street fighters into there, specifically using this idea that the society was dysfunctional, and the rhetoric was almost as if they were colleagues of the communists, but disagreed with them on how to fix things. And of course, they're out in the streets trying to beat the crap out of them, if not kill them instead. So it was disingenuous, but I think there is a level to which it kind of is genuine, and that they like to internalize the idea that there is a reciprocity, that there is a voluntary association of violence between them and an equivalent on the left. So Blair Cottrell over in Melbourne used to keep going on about anarchists, and it's not like anarchists have their own street thugs out there, but the way he talked about it was as if they did, as if he was in a war against them, and they also had like umpteen criminal convictions for armed possession and assault and blah blah blah, which is simply not true. So, but I mean, I do think we should bear in mind that it's not a good idea to play into that game. If they're posturing as violence, then posturing back does not help your cause. You know, uh, yeah. So it is exactly what they want. So yeah. So the definitions that come uh, that people use for fascism are quite often quite long, and they tend to be um, just lists of different, as I said, like lists of things that they do. But a central part is this instrumentalism, which means that in the end that they don't have any solid principles. They can choose to um, dump, dump their core beliefs for um, for tactical reasons or strategic reasons. So those core beliefs aren't really core beliefs. And I think we have to understand that as well. Like, you're not going to find um, anything solid that you can point to, and saying you can't call someone fascist because they don't have such and such an ingredient doesn't work either. There is nothing, no single thing that you can point to say someone's fascist. It really has to be contextual. And if we're going to use the word at all to mean anything apart from something that died with Mussolini, then we need to be more contextual and more critical in our usage of it. So, like examples of how they don't really have a core belief would be like it gives them a kind of a level of gumption as well, like the Nazis making propaganda about the horrors of the Soviets killing Poles in the Katyn forest, where they uncovered mass graves. What at the same time as they're committing mass murder against Poles on a regular basis. This sort of thing. This is a key part of of uh, of fascism as well. That there are no limits to their gumption, to their disingenuousness. But I mean, it kind of brings us to a sort of paradox with like the disingenuousness is almost a principle for them. So by being disingenuous, they're actually being true to their principles. So they, the more hypocritical they are, the less hypocritical they are in some ways, since hypocrisy is what they believe in. Anyway, if the upshot of this is when you use the term fascist and some terminally online person says, "Oh, you're misusing the word. You can't even define it." I think the answer to that is well, you give a definition then, because they also will struggle. It's just not that easy to just give a pithy definition. It is inherently subjective. Um, And again, I consider, like most people consider the Nazis to be fascists. To be fair, it's only a very small. It's a it's only a group of people who are very purist who would disagree with that. And again, Hitler was inspired by Mussolini, but not really as much by his political writings as by his actions. What he admired was Mussolini's March on Rome and the way he kind of took over politics without bothering with the sort of norms of legitimacy and so forth. He just used the tools that were there, and he didn't worry too much about right or wrong and that sort of thing. So yeah, along with the different definitions, another problematic with the definitions, I think, is that they, the purists get angry at people who call General Franco a fascist, which to me is a little bit ridiculous. I mean, the thing is that the leader of the Spanish Falange, the fascist party there, and Falange more or less is a translation of fascist, close enough to. And it was a consciously fascist party, and he was killed by the Republicans, and General Franco was made the new leader, even though he hadn't been part of the party. He was the leader of their rebellion against the Republican against the Republic of Spain, and he basically said, "All right, I'll be leader," but he also brought in a couple of smaller far-right conservative groups and added traditionalist to the name, and that that has been the reason why some even non-purists say that this was not a a fascist party and he didn't run a fascist regime. Whereas my counterpoint would be that, like, like fascism was in the name. He was arguably the most successful fascist ruler of them all. His regime survived his death, and he died of natural causes, more or less. Well, when he was very old anyway. So, in some ways, if you exclude him from fascism, then it's kind of it becomes a very meaningless term indeed. Right? And the reason people say that he wasn't a fascist, he was an authoritarian conservative or whatever, is I think it is a desire for apologism for the regime, and I actually think that people vastly underestimate the amount of blood that those people spilled. The mass executions, the public executions, the mass graves that are found all through Spain, the nature of the regime, the terror of the regime once it was implemented, was um, was palpable to people. A lot of people had to flee the country. There was no way you could remain and just openly say, I disagree with your politics, but I'm not no longer going to be trying to shoot you and be left alone. You if you were a leftist, you had to hide or leave. That was either hide physically or hide your affiliation, or you had to leave. Otherwise, they would um, imprison you, torture you, and kill you. Probably all three. Um, so it was a very brutal regime. There is still um, a lot of contention in Spanish society over it and its meaning, and and people are still fighting to bring historical memory back, repressed historical memory, because that is, after all, as we're going to find out, one of the essences of fascism is controlling the narrative, and that means rewriting history. So that was what was done there. And so the people there don't necessarily understand their own history, and they too may think it's all exaggerated. Anyway, so fascism, the way I'm defining it, of course, is more of a set of uh, approaches and behaviors and underlying beliefs that are almost part of a basic psychology rather than a coherent political ideology with a with an author and a following and so forth. Um, yes, they generate followings, but those followings tend to be based on emotion, sentiment. A lot of what they do is based on sentiment. And this is obviously a human potential, so it's never not been part of human society. So why did fascism only start, as we know it, only start with Mussolini, or as I would argue, like organisations like there were previous organisations like the KKK, but they didn't rule countries, start wars, and so forth. Well, I think the reason for that is that there's these are fundamental human tendencies, but they didn't have any. Partly they didn't have room for expression, and partly they didn't have any need for expression previously. Under a monarchical system, like a king might be fascistically inclined, but it's hardly going to. I mean, you say take Henry V or Henry VIII, you could see elements of fascism in them, or or you could see, for example, in the way Richard III is portrayed in the version where he's played by Gandalf. It's very good. Anyway, they portray him as being basically a fascist. You can see that there are ways you can see these tendencies in history, but of course, the need to appeal to a populist base was often less, and when it did happen, the leader would be a warlord. They wouldn't need to create a constitution that legitimated them their rule by, in modernist terms, as a kind of opposition to democracy. So that is why fascism came about as it did when it did. Um, this doesn't mean that it has to arrive in an actual democracy, but in every polity, the people have power. This has been known forever. But, and like people have often exploited it as a populist thing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about getting their votes. So the kind of this system was almost one that can really be reduced to might makes right. And if you can get away with something, then you should get away with something. And in fact, it's almost moral to get away with what you can. And, so it also, like looking at the intellectual culture, the culture is one of bad faith in any sort of argumentation. And of course, the flexibility of not really being tied down to any particular principles, except perhaps, as I said, the principle of always be a hypocrite. Reasoning, they don't use reasoning to work out what to think or work out what is true. They use reasoning, they already know where they want to go. They use reasoning to find ways of making the argument, winning the argument. All right. And those arguments, again, it's really often based on sentiment, and this sentiment is often grievance and aggression, or a sense of entitlement too. So we have, I mean, this is again, we should really have been picking up on these things happening in front of on our screens a lot recently. You can see the whole white male entitlement syndrome and the sense of grievance, and all of this has been building up, and it really is so reminiscent of more of, I mean, definitely way more of pre-Nazi Weimar Germany rather than the Italy before Mussolini came to power. So again, I mean, in some ways, I guess I am basing my thinking more on Nazism than fascism per se, because I truly believe that Nazism was the epitome of fascism rather than actual fascism. And other people will disagree with that. And that's fair enough. But I think it's useful to think of Nazism as the epitome of fascism. So what they use this sort of unprincipled approach for in debate, but also like through the use of force and so forth, is to try and control narratives, and they create a kind of simulated reality which ticks all the boxes. Everything they want to believe, they believe, and they will create whatever mental shortcuts they will are needed for that, and then they use whatever intellectual or physical power they have to try and enforce that kind of pseudo episteme on other people, so that like the other people are forced to accept their framework of things and are caught in the trap of basically concurring with their ideas and therefore ultimately their solutions. So, I mean, in a way, fascism is in this consciously mimicking the way in which ideologies, natural ideologies, create blinders and create double standards, create an orthodoxy that traps people into a way of seeing things. But again, like they believe in being unprincipled, as it were. So it is to some extent self-conscious, especially to begin with, and tries to not be caught in a completely coherent belief system, because then the contradictions would start to trip them up. Once they, like start to lose their edge, once the kind of true believers kind of start to take over a bit, they do lose some of their agility, and they become more prone to get tripped up by their dogma. And I think that one of the reasons that fascism was short-lived in its initial run, this dispersed fascism that we see arising now has been coming a long time. Once it comes to a head, it probably will self-destruct in a generation. Will the human race survive that generation? That's another story. Self-destruction may come at the expense of all of us, but it's probably not a sustainable long-run thing. It may simply transform, however, into a different form of authoritarianism. Who knows? So the sort of cognitive dissonance that arises from holding a particular orthodox beliefs that aren't shaped by reality, they're predetermined, and they don't want reality or reasoning to inform these things. The same as, say, a theological regime. So this creates potential for cognitive dissonance, but the fascist approach to that is to really, really aggressively not give a shit about reality. So, like, to revel in not giving a shit. It's like, so there's no Jesuits trying to devote like incredible amounts of time to incredibly complicated explanations to keep them on track. Instead, it's like, if you cross a certain line, then the fists or the guns will come out. They'll be yelling, they'll be screaming. There will be the more they're challenged, the more they will use tactics to avoid any anything like that. And I don't think they suffer from cognitive dissonance at all. They can happily hold contradictory thoughts in their heads without any sort of dissonance at all. So one of the things they want from their followers is the ability to just accept what they're told, regardless of how much it might contradict what they've previously been told, and or how much it might contradict what they've been told are fundamentals of the ideology they're supposed to believe in. And you can see this at play in the Christo-fascists, particularly, who are often told to accept. They're told to accept people like Donald Trump as a leader. When obviously he is very antithetical to what they say they believe in. He personifies certain things that are antithetical to what they believe in due to his lifestyle and stuff like that. So, in fascism, like, leaders are also kind of given a lot of leeway, or especially in the current fascism, but this is also true in 1920s Germany, for example. Leaders are given a lot of leeway for dog whistling to their followers, like who will take any sign as confirmation that they they're doing the right thing. They're going to drain the swamp, for example, and then they can do whatever they want, um, even though it might radically contradict that. But those followers will believe in the dog whistles and not believe in the actions. The actions will just be pushed aside as irrelevant. Um, and we have people like Viktor Orban who like can dog whistle, and then like if the critics come along and say, "Oh, you're a bit of a fascist, aren't you?" Then he'll do something that'll just prove he's not a fascist, because no fascist would do such and such. And they know what they're doing now, and I think you get a very similar effect from the Trump organization flooding the zone with shit, because they they can pick and choose. If they're winning in certain things, then they can run with it. But if things don't work out for them, they can kind of reassure the people who are worried about fascism by losing those battles, and sometimes by even like maybe admitting that it was wrong. You know, if they really want to take it far. So there's like this is like part of the, I think, an effect of flooding the zone. Um, and, the perfect fascist follower, the perfect fascist, kind of, as a result, they kind of view themselves at once as being this tiny cog in a big machine, a big, powerful machine with leaders and authorities. But at the same time, they believe in themselves as a free individual. And they don't see a contradiction in that. They believe that, like, their enslavement to others is a form of freedom. So this is perhaps why people sometimes see it kind of proto-fascism in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract. Because he's saying people can be forced to be free, and like people say this is an inspiration for Hitler and so forth. But I'm it's a bit unfair on Rousseau, but anyway, the Nazis were very good at kind of giving people the idea that they were preserving their German freedoms by becoming slaves to Nazism, and they would manifest this by giving people things in their lifestyle that made them feel like they had freedom, and they had the whole strength through joy thing, where they're kind of giving people holidays and stuff like that. So I think that you can see something similar already inbuilt in US culture, which creates this kind of pseudo freedom for consumers who are wage slaves, who can actually have very little freedom indeed. But like if they're a certain status, if they have enough money, they actually like can get a lot of nice goodies, and that can always be um, aspirational for the people below them as well. So and the thing is that in a weird way, both these systems kind of get people to obey and do what someone else wants them to do, by saying, well, this is what you want, and this is in your self-interest. So be selfish, be horrible, obey. You know, um, and they often say that like confidence tricks. Often, like the essence of confidence tricks is to appeal to people's greed and selfishness as well. So you can see it in those terms as well. So they're promoting a kind of egocentricity, and they exploit people's narcissistic tendencies, and also I think they create a culture of narcissism. That means that so that people who, I mean, I'm not sure that people are born narcissistic or where it comes from, but people who wouldn't otherwise be narcissistic become increasingly narcissistic. And then they uh, kind of exploit that sort of egotism to attach to the collective identity, and use it to create this sharp division between the inside and the outside group, which is, of course, one of the great dangers of fascism, is the dehumanization and the violence that comes out of it. So they become sociopathic as well with regards to people outside of their group. So their empathy becomes constrained only to people who fit a certain mold, and they don't really have empathy for people outside of it. They cannot. They lose their theory of mind even with them. They don't really see them as human. They stop being able to put themselves in the other person's shoes. And, I mean, it's pretty hard at the moment not to reference the way Israelis are about Palestinians in this regard. They simply, their thinking repeatedly shows that they do not understand the idea of what being a Palestinian is like. They have a bunch of narratives that suit their purposes, and they keep um, becoming more and more invested in those narratives, and becoming more dangerous as they do so. So they have this kind of willful obtuseness, therefore, and that sort of like, and again, the kind of, it doesn't really, it's not that far from what I was talking about in their instrumental way of dealing with debate and knowledge itself, you know. So they do control the narrative. They want to frame things to suit their arguments that they know they can win, which are often linked to thought-ending cliches or thought-ending pieties. So when you're losing an argument, if you've got something like, the word terrorism, for example, you support terrorism, you're terrorists, you can shut people down that way. So that way they can, because people's response it is to, their only response in that case is to then say, oh, yes, but when you say terrorism, this is a construct, blah, blah, blah. It's very lengthy. You have to deconstruct something that they've already got a shortcut for. Hence, thought ending. There's the shortcut there. They can just slam it in your face, and they will with verbal violence to shut you down. So, uh, and then, that's they go to quite a lot of effort. I don't know how conscious this is. Some of it seems to be conscious, and some of it seems to be by instinct. But they go to a lot of effort to make sure that narratives stay within those rigid tracks that that they can control. So, fascism is obviously authoritarian, but is it really authoritarian? Because it believes more, it believes in authoritarianism in the sense of exercising coercive power, but it doesn't necessarily, although again, we'll go back to the fact that it's got this core conservatism in it, it doesn't necessarily believe in preserving the authority of the status quo. So this is something that's confused people a lot, because it can be radical, it can be revolutionary, and so forth. Um, and it so is it, like, is it reactionary? Is it conservative, or is it not? Like when they're trying to radically change a government, is it radically reactionary because it's trying to bring back something when it's not, when it's so modernist that it's, despite its own rhetoric, it's not really trying to go back. Um, it uh, it is a little bit of a conundrum, but probably not something we should worry ourselves too much about. Um, there's a very simple answer to it. If you look at Mussolini as a rebel, or Hitler, I mean, Timothy Snyder called Hitler and Goebbels anarchists, um, which is ridiculous. And he is a ridiculous man. But like what he was referring to was, the disrespect for the existing powers that be and the existing way of doing things. And then you have, like, I would say you could look at someone like Peter Thiel, who's a libertarian, or in fact, a lot of so-called libertarians nowadays. In fact, probably more than half of them this applies to. And it's a very simple thing. It's not that they're against authority, they just want themselves to be at the top of that authority. It's that simple. And it's not, they really do believe in hierarchies. They just don't believe that they personally should be constrained by anyone else. Now, do they want to take along their little club of buddies with them and see their own buddies not constrained as well? Well, obviously, the libertarians do. But, yeah, this is not anti-authoritarianism. Not really. It's very much authoritarian in its own way. So, the moving on to, for the moment at least, to like what moral basis they have for fascism, and again, like, it doesn't really seem like they bother with morals much, but everyone does. Everyone tries to justify themselves in a moral way. So I think that the moral basis, though, is kind of the fake fairness of the kind of bully figure who really doesn't actually have morals, but tries to justify themselves by creating this sort of parity I was talking about earlier between them and the other, the victim, basically. So for a racist fascist like Hitler, he believed in this kind of social Darwinist version of races. Um, although um, at the risk of complicating things slightly, he wasn't 100% like reductive to genetics about this. He was also talking about culture, so he kind of could play both sides there. But it didn't. He could be as racist as he wanted when he wanted to be, but also sometimes just switch it out a bit, just to be like a bit more nuanced if that wasn't working for him. So for Hitler, there's this fairness that comes from the fact that races are at war with each other by nature. Therefore, um, we're, being dishonest about that doesn't help matters. It just conceals the reality, and we should let these race wars, fight out, and the best should win because that is the best thing for humanity. And then that would show merit for your race. And social Darwinists. Obviously, this is somewhat social Darwinist, but social Darwinists in an individual sense, which Hitler also was, believe the same for um, for individual humans. There should be conditions in which some die and some thrive, and that is all for the good. It's you can see this as a an argument for merit as well, rather than just a pure utilitarian argument. They're saying that the survivors, the winners, have merit. You know? Again, instrumentality. The merit is that you are, if you can win, you are meritorious. We get yeah. Let's go slightly off the beaten track here. We do get a lot of messages about this. There's a lot of fascist ideology in normal fiction entertainment that's been around for a long time, and particularly coming out of the US, but not exclusively, which associates um, being morally good with being good at killing people. You know, it is constantly reinforced in action movies, and if you start to look for it, you'll see it everywhere. And you should, I mean, we should all be aware of that and ask ourselves about what that has informed in ourselves and the people around us, including some of our more dim-witted politicians who don't seem to really grasp the difference between um, fantasy and reality that well. Anyway, so I was talking about the way they create the idea of merit from winners and losers. Well, market fascists are exactly the same, and um, this is going back again to neoliberalism being the greatest form of fascism there is in the world today. Well, this is what they believe. It is actually, it's not. It's pretty social Darwinist stuff. If you look at Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom, the way he frames, the freedom is freedom to starve to death in the gutter. Like, obviously, it lends itself to a social Darwinist interpretation as well, even though he's not making. And he's arguing that it's necessary anyway, but you kind of get, like, you definitely suspect an undercurrent of a social Darwinist thing there. And, this is, it, um, it's hard to understand why anyone wouldn't see that in Hayek's argument, because you're basically saying that you're creating a system in which the weak will die, and that's good for them. Anyway, I think there is also this social Darwinism obviously suits racists, and neoliberalism suits social Darwinism, and I think there is a bit more of an interplay there than we've admitted to thus far. Let's put it that way. So in the 1970s, Milton Friedman, who I am going to tell you right now was a fascist, had a TV show, and he it was it ticked all of the boxes I've talked about control, and in terms of controlling the narrative so far. So he would play a short film of his devising, making a point. Then he'd have someone critique it. Basically, he had some of the lamest critics you could imagine, apart from one Marxist guy, a lone Marxist guy that he'd like liberal, some liberal or some church person or some, who really didn't have much to say. And then once that person had critiqued it, he'd just go, well, actually, and then just lay out um, his um, yeah, um, let's say, specious response to the critics, and then they would get no opportunity to respond to that. He just like the whole thing was structured to be quite unprincipled in the way it did things. And there was one episode where he talks about um, the the way in which immigrants come to places and make good and work hard, make good, blah 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 blah. And this is like, and he sort of mentions African Americans migrating from the south to the cities of the north, and why they haven't made good, and kind of like leaves this, constructs this massive space, huge vacuum of explanation into which he's kind of implying that they are genetically inferior. It's really bad. Anyway, I think that you can see how racists like this idea of free market competition and merit through that, and why they're attracted to books like The Bell Curve. And again, sort of associated with the kind of again, like these um, ideas associated with social Darwinism as well as racism. So these neoliberal types, you could look at the Koch brothers, the Atlas Network, Mont Pelerin, the Hoover Institute, the PayPal Mafia. They conflate this kind of structure of neoliberalism with which they say is meritocratic, and it's got this hidden racist social Darwinist side that, again, I don't think it's that well hidden, but it's hidden well enough to stop most people talking about it. And you get like they have like recently we have heard of this guy Curtis Yarvin, who's this ideologue of those sorts, who's promoted by Teal, for example. And he denies being a white nationalist, but he says he said later he's not necessarily averse to white nationalism, and he does think that slavery wasn't necessarily as bad as people made out. And he likes the Roman Patria Potestas, which it was the Roman system whereby the male head of the household exercised law over everyone else and could kill them with no repercussions, which kind of is like a kind of atomized version of Mussolini's corporatism. Really, it is like this uber paternalistic power, and so this is who is this guy is being promoted at the moment by very powerful people, and he thinks that some of the population are always going to be useless mouths, and he wants to stick them all in solitary confinement but make their lives bearable by giving them VR. Yeah, I mean, it's bad. It's really bad, and the fact that we've reached a point where these ideas are taken seriously by very powerful people, even though they'd never get broad currency. But those people, of course, they're going to be talking to the public in a different language from what they believe. This is, I think, one of the essences of how this dispersed fascism has come to power, is that they have secret beliefs and they know not to talk about it. So they're not Il Duce up there, you know, stamping the foot and rah-rah-rahing. They know to speak a different language when they talk to the public. And obviously the obvious ones in this respect are the Christo-fascists, who, have beliefs that would really turn people off them, but they keep it secret. They have coded language. There's hence the dog whistling and so forth. But so do these these techno-fascists, these market fascists, whatever you want to call them. One of the things it all adds up to, and this is an incredibly strong strain in fascism, is a hatred of the weak and a definition of themselves as strong. And this is part of why I think they become very spiteful, and why they feel why they indulge those narcissistic tendencies that people feel elevated by bringing others low. And again, you can go back to that sense of grievance, that sense of aggression, and so forth. Right, well, I was going to try and do this in one lot, but I'm probably about halfway through, and this seems like it's quite long so far. So I might actually stop for now, and post this as part one, and then return with part two in time. Right, thank you for listening. I don't have any books to recommend as yet, so next one I'm only going to be recommending one book, because I'll be doing a written follow-up to this around that book. So I will see you then, and thank you again.